As people join us, I thought I'd just go ahead and begin. My name is Judy Wu. I'm the director of the UCI Humanities Center. Thank you so much for being with us. We know it's a very busy time of the quarter, and it's also a very busy time of the day. So we really value the fact that you're joining us tonight. I'm really excited to be presenting this conversation and film screening. We have a lot of partners at UCI who have made this possible, and I'd like to just name them. So they are the UCI Humanities Center, the Associate Dean's Office of Undergraduate Studies, Social Sciences, the Latinx Resource Center, Student Outreach and Retention Center, Dream Center, Asian American Pacific Islander Staff Association, AAPI Women in Leadership, Center for Latin American Studies, Center for Medical Humanities, Child Family Comprehensive Cancer Center, Cross Cultural Center, Kababayan, LGBT Resource Center, Prime LC, and the UCI Illuminations. I just want to share tonight that I first met Set Rongkilyo maybe just over 3 years ago. At the time, I was chairing the Department of Asian American Studies, and we collaborated with community partners to host a symposium on Asian American and Pacific Islander and documented students. I was so struck by how nurturing he is as a person, his honesty, his willingness to share his vulnerability. So I'm really thrilled that he's back with us today, at least virtually, back to UCI. Our program tonight will begin with Set, who's the filmmaker for coverage, and he'll be in conversation with Paulina Raygoza, who's the director of the UCI Student Outreach and Retention Center. If you have any questions that you would like to pose to Set and also our panelists later on, please feel free to use the Q&A function, the question and answer function. They will set the stage for the screening of Coverage, which is such a timely film about the pressing issues of healthcare access and healthcare coverage, regardless of immigration status. Because of the tricky quality of broadcasting film through Zoom, when we get to that stage of the film screening, what we're planning to do is share with you a link to Vimeo so you have a higher quality viewing experience. And then we'll be inviting you back at a particular time. And at that point, you'll have a chance to meet with the two main protagonists of the film, Hector Plasencia and also Emma. And that portion of the conversation will be moderated by Adeli Duran, who's the director of the Latinx Resource Center. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about the campaign I'll be discussing, the Health for All campaign, I'll be posting in just a minute a link about that organization and about that movement. And also at the end of the evening, we'll be asking you to complete a survey about the film and what you learned, your engagement with that film, and we'll be posting that a little bit later as well. So for now, I'm gonna issue a short poll to get a sense of who we have in the audience. And as I'm doing that, I'm gonna turn the stage over to Paulina and Set.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see everyone here. And I also want to just kind of really give a big thanks to Set for being with us today and kind of giving his time and sharing his knowledge and expertise, as well as just kind of sharing this beautiful movie with us. The documentary, I think, definitely has a very powerful message. So thank you so much, Set. I'm going to ask you if you don't mind unmiking or unmuting yourself, so that way we can have a dialogue around some of the questions that we've set for you. And then also again, remind the audience that if they have questions that they want to ask Set, to please add them into the Q&A portion, and then we can go ahead and ask them for you. So really our first question for you, Set, is really in the creation of the documentary, what made you choose to elevate the voices of and narratives really of Emma and Hector, who are with us today?
Thank you, Paulina, for that question. And thank you. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you to the entire UCI team for inviting us to share coverage for the UCI community. And thank you, Judy, for the warm words earlier. Actually, I met Judy on my 25th birthday because the panel that I participated that she was leading was on my 25th birthday. So what a wonderful gift to be able to build community with you all many moons ago. With the documentary coverage, I have been, my first involvement in the Health for All movement actually was in 2015. My first job ever after college was to do communications work for the Healthy California team, where Hector and I worked together. And we were doing work around the time to help pass Health for All Kids, which was a campaign to expand the Medi-Cal for low-income undocumented people up to the age of 18, I believe. And when I started working at the California Immigrant Policy Center, my work was to develop a short documentary for the Health for All campaign, which the California Immigrant Policy Center is one of the key organizations that's leading as part of the Health for All Coalition. And last year, the effort was to be able to advance healthcare access for young adults up to the age of 26 or 25, I believe. And that around the time, it was very likely that healthcare for young adults will be included in the budget in the state and will be passed, by the legislature. So the intention originally actually was to develop a documentary about the implementation of Health for All young adults. But what we were trying to be intentional about is to elevate the voices of folks that are often excluded from these conversations around healthcare access. As you're going to see in the film, Hector talks a lot about, in the immigrant rights movement, the voices of young adults, youth are often elevated, but the needs and the leadership of elders are often overlooked. So what we did is really elevate the voices of folks that are often not included in the conversation. I was working and volunteering with the Filipino Worker Center. Tita Mirla Baldonado, who served as associate producer for the film, was the one that connected me to Emma during my volunteering with them. And when we reached out to Emma, we wanted to be intentional to really elevate the leadership of folks like her, who is a leader at the National Domestic Workers Alliance with the Filipino Worker Center, a grandmother, a caregiver, all the things pretty much is Emma. I'm every woman, to quote Chaka Khan and Whitney Houston, So really being able to elevate the leadership of folks, who are elders, who are home care workers, because often when we think about organizers, we think about often people in our age group, right? Millennials, Gen Z, but really not really elevating the leadership of older folks. And Hector is one of the, key leaders since the beginning of the Health for All movement. And we really wanted to also be able to elevate the experiences of folks, who are, queer, trans, non-binary, in this conversation around healthcare access. That's the other thing too. When we talk about healthcare access, how do we think about healthcare access for queer, trans, non-binary people, access to things like HIV prevention, if you don't have access to healthcare but undocumented, for undocumented people that are HIV positive, for example, what does healthcare access look like for community members, So we wanted to be able to elevate, the experiences of a different groups of undocumented folks beyond just what we always see in the media, but also show undocumented people not just as survivors of the circumstances that we live in, but really as leaders pushing the envelope for our communities, whether they're elderly people, whether they've been involved in the movement or not, and really showing us as the people that have agency over the issues that are impacting our lives.
Thank you for sharing that. I guess one of my other questions that we had for you is really about what challenges did you experience as a filmmaker, right? And also as someone who was in the movement and who has been in the movement for a while in making this film. And then where did you feel yourself having to stretch and kind of push your own kind of acknowledge, I guess, your own privileges and your own knowledge within this movement to kind of stretch yourself as an individual and as an advocate, and then be able to show that to other folks and to help other folks grow as well?
Yeah, so when we were creating the film, there was actually another community member who's also undocumented that, we were hoping to highlight in the film. And originally, they were very much, in and shared with us their interest in being included in the film. But as we were finalizing the last cut as we were getting ready for our LA premiere last November, when they consulted with their lawyer, they were saying that they can no longer be involved in the film, so they had to back out, right? And often in the filmmaking community, in the documentary space, there's this kind of power dynamic that exists, between the person who wields the camera and the person who is in front of the camera. And I think, there's also this assumption that because you signed a release or because you gave consent, right, to be able to share your story in the film, that, inevitably and permanently also the filmmaker has control over your story, right? But we're really intentional, about being able to make sure that folks have agency over how their stories are told, when their stories are told, and really practicing consent culture, in whatever way that makes sense, right? So we had to. So ultimately, we figured out how to cut the film so that the film still works, without their story. It looks like it worked so far, and just being mindful and intentional about being in communication with our protagonists, as we tell the story. I think also when we work in movement spaces, right, particularly where I come from, in the advocacy organizing space, there's often times where we overlook the importance of cultural work, storytelling work, in the space, and not just kind of fitting into to pre-formulated messaging and talking points, and really diving into the narratives of people and respecting them as they are. For example, there was a time when someone told me, the film is too long, in one of the feedback sessions. The film is 30 minutes, okay? People spent money watching a movie like Lord of the Rings, which is 3 hours long, about, a fantasy world, which is totally valid, right? How can we make sure that we don't overlook the need to amplify the stories of community members who are undocumented, right? If we can invest time to watch 2.5 hours of our lives watching, these superhero movies, they're great, right? And how can we make sure to invest the same amount of time and respect, to the stories of folks that are undocumented? So even within movement space, I think that's also where, not friction necessarily, but how can we make sure to push the envelope, even within our own groups of people, who you'd think are down, to elevate the stories of people, but often being stuck to ways of organizing. And how can we be more intentional in including the voices of artists, not just as people who develop art for movement, but also as people that we think things through with, in the same way that we think about directly impacted people, not just as spokespeople, but also as co-leaders in the work that we're doing around advocacy.
So that brings me to my last question really for you. And maybe even like words of inspiration or advice that you would give to other like filmmakers that are also pushing really, I think, important messages around advocacy. So why is filmmaking a critical tool in advocacy efforts, right? Or in movements that are happening right now? And how can, what advice would you give future filmmakers?
Yeah, thank you for the last question, Paulina. So also just to share, I'm part of the Undocumented Filmmakers Collective. And we are a group of about 30 undocumented filmmakers across the country. We have folks in Durham, North Carolina, in New York, throughout LA, in Colorado. And often undocumented people are often perceived just as sources of story, but rarely as the people who are given resources to tell stories, right? Often being excluded from funding opportunities. And also undocumented people not often being the primary audiences. When we create stories about undocumented people, my experience, having been in organizing spaces for the last decade, is stories are created for people that can vote, so that they can gain empathy towards undocumented people, so that they can vote on behalf of undocumented people. Why can't we just make stories and cater them to undocumented people so that undocumented people can see, not just our faces in the screen, not just our bodies in the screen, but the fullness of our humanity in the story, so that we can feel like our stories are being told as fully as possible. So I think for me, what's important is that when we think about storytelling, I think it's kind of like a dialectic, or there's this not contradiction, but there's different ways to look at it. The way I think about storytelling, you know, there's an advocacy level to telling the stories of undocumented folks, which is totally valid, right? But I also think about, you know, my mom, who's like the OG storyteller in my life. My mom has this knack for developing these photo albums of me and my siblings when we were younger, you know, and kind of like curating a timeline of our lives and telling our stories in that way. But did my mom create these photo albums because ultimately she's hoping to advocate for immigrant rights and show these, you know, the narrative of our family to Congress members? You know, that's not why my mom created, you know, these photo albums. Often it's just for remembering, right? You know, like just to remember. And I think for us, it's important to think about what storytelling means and the different ways that we can use storytelling. I often quote this indigenous Maori scholar, Linda Tuhiwai Smith, who wrote this book called Decolonizing Methodologies. In that book, she says something along the lines of, the remembering of a people relates not so much to the remembering of a golden past, but often it's a painful past. And more importantly, people's responses to that pain. So sometimes, you know, maybe we tell stories for an advocacy purpose. Sometimes we just tell stories because we want to remember, you know, who our communities are, who our family members are, and just, you know, honor their dignity, right? You know, sometimes we tell stories because we don't have answers. Sometimes we actually have more questions. And often I think that's where artists come in. You know, we push the envelope in thinking more expansively about an issue. And often we don't have the solutions, but maybe we can ask the questions that dig deeper into the problem so that through those right questions, we can get to better responses, right? So I think being able to think about art, not just for the sake of art, but think about art in its context in the bigger global reality that we live in as part of a community, you know, and being able to expand the way we think about cultural practice in the work that we're doing. And if I can just make one last plug, you know, if you're doing work with undocumented people, make sure that folks that are directly impacted, you know, are included in the work that you're doing. If you're doing research, if you're doing storytelling about people that are formerly incarcerated, people that are domestic workers, people that are immigrants, people that are undocumented, you know, don't assume that just because we're coming from a particular point of view or particular lived experience, that we're just quote unquote subjects, right? You know, make sure that we're collaborators in the process whenever you do work with directly impacted people. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I know that we're gonna have switch gears in a little bit, but I want to thank you again for pushing the envelope, and I think also reframing, right, how I think we approach this work around filmmaking and advocacy, and really creating a different culture, I think, for us to really think about and to, again, really elevate stories that aren't really told, and also to make sure that it's done in community, right, with folks. So I want to thank you again for that. I believe that Judy is going to share with us a link so we can go ahead and view the actual documentary. And then we're going to invite folks to come back so we can continue our conversation.
Thank you so much, Set. You are just as amazing as ever. And I guess maybe a late happy birthday for 28 for this year. I just wanted to share the results of our first poll so you get a sense of who is in the audience. A few more people have since joined us. Social science, social ecology, you guys rock. Undergraduate students, yay. So I'm going to stop this now. It's 6:22. The documentary will take about 30 minutes. So what I'm going to do now is share with you the link to the film, and please go watch it. But please also come back. I'm going to set the time for coming back to 6:55. So you get to watch the film, maybe grab a small bite to eat, maybe take a bathroom break. But we want you to come back and meet Emma and Hector. Please do try the link and the password. And if you have any problems, please just let us know and we'll try to troubleshoot as much as we can.